The house always had a rhythm, a quiet ebb and flow of daily life that from the outside might have seemed ordinary. But inside, the currents of tension, understanding, and fragile patience ran deep. I had always thought of our home as a sanctuary, a place where my children, even as adults, could find themselves without the constant pressures of the world outside. My daughter, at 24, was living with us while saving for her own place. She was on antidepressants, which she managed meticulously, though in her own understated way. The pill bottles sat in her bathroom with their lids slightly loose, a small concession to her daily routine. She was the only one who ever used them, so it had never been a problem more, so I thought. My son, now 23, had been living independently in a condo with his girlfriend, who was 22. Circumstances had shifted, and temporarily they were staying with us until their place was ready. The adjustment was small but noticeable. Their bathroom was cramped, with a sink so small there was barely room for a toothbrush. It was a minor inconvenience, but it highlighted the differences between their habits and ours. My daughter's bathroom, by contrast, had a double sink and ample counter space, giving her a sense of control and order she clung to amidst her mental health challenges. I hadn't anticipated how much this difference would matter. The day began like any other, a delicate dance of routines overlapping. I noticed my daughter moving quietly about her room, headphones in, probably working on her writing or watching something that allowed her to be in her own head. Her world was organized, intentional, a careful balancing act of self-care and independence even within the confines of our home. In another part of the house, my son and his girlfriend were adjusting to being back under my roof, unpacking essentials from their temporary stay, and trying not to disrupt the household that had once been theirs in a completely different way. The first hint of friction came from something seemingly trivial. The girlfriend wanted to dye her hair. The small bathroom downstairs made it impossible to spread out the dyeing kit or the supplies, so I suggested she use my daughter's bathroom. It seemed practical at the time, a solution that made sense in terms of space and convenience. What I didn't consider was that I was stepping into the delicate ecosystem of my daughter's personal space. I had assumed that her being home in her room meant she wouldn't mind, that she would be fine with this minor intrusion. I was wrong. About an hour later, the first tremor of conflict reached me. I overheard my son speaking in hushed, urgent tones to his girlfriend. "I don't know how to tell her," he muttered, almost to himself. The words weren't directed at me, but the tone carried the weight of impending confrontation. When he finally explained, it was worse than I anticipated. His girlfriend had accidentally knocked over my daughter's pills. Some had spilled directly into the sink she was using to dye her hair. The practical implications, lost doses, contamination, disruption of a routine carefully managed, were immediately clear. I intended to talk to my daughter calmly, to explain the mishap and help mediate a resolution, but my son insisted on being the one to tell her. I watched, a knot tightening in my chest, as he approached her room with a mix of irritation and caution. "Don't start acting like an ass," he said, the words sharp and defensive. "But girlfriend knocked your pills into the sink." It was a poorly chosen approach, and the tension in his voice carried the potential for disaster. The reaction was instantaneous. My daughter, upon hearing this, was furious. She grabbed the remaining pills and stormed off. Her movements sharp and precise, a physical manifestation of her anger. My son, as if to shift responsibility, blamed her for leaving the lid loose. The room felt suddenly smaller, heavier, the air dense with frustration. My daughter, never one to mince words, asked why her pills had even been in her bathroom if the space was to be shared. When I explained the reasoning behind allowing them to use her bathroom, her fury escalated. "They could have used theirs or yours," she snapped. Her voice, sharp with indignation, filled the hallway. I tried to intervene, to mediate, to calm the situation. I reminded her that I hadn't expected this to happen and urged her to calm down. But the words did little to dampen the storm of emotions. She called my son an asshole and retreated into her room, shutting the door with a finality that echoed through the house. The conflict was no longer about spilled pills or bathroom space, had become a collision of boundaries, assumptions, and unspoken frustrations that had been building for years. The aftermath of that initial confrontation was a delicate negotiation. I encouraged my son and his girlfriend to apologize, my reasoning being that respect and acknowledgement were essential for family harmony. The girlfriend refused, her stance rigid, unwilling to admit fault or show empathy. My son eventually cooled down and offered an apology, though it was tempered by lingering resentment and the belief that my daughter should have responded differently. Meanwhile, my daughter took action that reflected her need for control and safety. She consulted her psychiatrist, replacing her medication and ensuring that her routine, her health, and her sense of security were maintained. Her decisions were firm, deliberate, and independent. She maintained that they should have asked her to move the pills or, at the very least, approached her without the assumption that she would overreact. She also pointed out, correctly, that she had only ever addressed her concerns to her brother, not to his girlfriend, and that I should never have permitted them to use her bathroom without consulting her. First, in those hours and days following the incident, the house was quiet but tense. Conversations were measured, gestures cautious. The dynamics had shifted, subtly but unmistakably. My daughter's space had been violated, and the consequences rippled through every interaction. My son continued to insist that she should apologize, framing the situation through his own lens of responsibility and fairness. I acknowledged that she could have reacted more calmly, but I also recognized the validity of her perspective. Boundaries had been crossed, assumptions had been made, and respect once taken for granted had been overlooked. Living together as adults in a single household was never going to be simple. Each of us carried histories, expectations, and routines that didn't always align. But what became clear in that week of tense silences, measured apologies, and careful conversation was that understanding had to be reciprocal. My daughter's reaction, though sharp, was grounded in a need for respect and personal safety. My son's frustration stemmed from a lack of perspective and an assumption that conflict could be resolved through insistence rather than dialogue. And I, caught in the middle, had to navigate the fragile lines between mediation, parental authority, and acknowledgement of personal boundaries. Even mundane details like the placement of a pill bottle became symbolic of larger truths: the importance of communication, the necessity of respecting personal space, and the complexity of balancing independence with family life. The house, usually a haven, had revealed its vulnerabilities, and the lessons learned were as subtle as they were profound. That quiet tension, that fragile interplay of understanding and misunderstanding, would echo in our interactions for weeks, shaping how we approached conflicts, privacy, and the delicate art of living together as a family every day after. I watched my daughter move through the house with a renewed sense of autonomy, a silent assertion that her routines, her health, and her boundaries mattered. My son, despite occasional moments of lingering irritation, began to adjust, realizing that control and authority could not be imposed without dialogue and consideration. And I, in the quiet of my own reflections, understood that mediation was not just about smoothing over conflict, but about validating the lived experiences and emotional truths of each person in the house. The first chapter of this story was not dramatic in the cinematic sense. There were no explosions or public confrontations, but it was charged with the subtle intensity that comes from living so closely with the people you love and having that closeness challenged. It was a lesson in patience, in listening, and in recognizing that even small acts like using someone else's bathroom carry weight, especially when they intersect with vulnerabilities and deeply personal routines. The quiet tensions, once simmering unnoticed beneath the surface, had finally revealed themselves, setting the stage for the unfolding drama that would demand careful navigation, understanding, and ultimately, respect. The incident had set the house on edge in ways that I hadn't fully anticipated. The spilled pills weren't just a momentary disruption, they became the spark for an emotional wildfire that revealed fractures in communication, assumptions about behavior, and the fragile lines of respect that crisscrossed our home. It all began with my son's decision to tell my daughter about the accident himself, a choice that, in hindsight, was ill-considered. He approached her room with that mix of irritation and self-righteousness that I had seen in him before, the kind that makes minor mistakes feel monumental. "Don't start acting like an ass," he said, his words clumsy and defensive. "But girlfriend knocked your pills into the sink." The delivery was sharp, clipped, lacking any preamble that might have softened the news. And like a match to dry tinder, my daughter's reaction was immediate and fierce. She snatched the remaining pills and stormed off, her movements precise, her anger palpable. I could see the logic, at least from my son's perspective. He believed he was helping, that delivering the news directly would prevent me from being drawn into another layer of conflict. But what he failed to anticipate was the depth of my daughter's need for agency and control, particularly over the routines that stabilized her mental health. She didn't just react, she asserted herself. She recognized the intrusion for what it was, a breach of trust and personal space. The tension escalated further when my son, attempting to deflect responsibility, blamed her for leaving the lid loose. His words implied negligence on her part, a subtle accusation that only fueled her fury. She demanded to know why her pills were in her bathroom to begin with, pointing out that they had alternatives, the small bathroom downstairs, or my own space if they truly needed the room. My explanation, meant to clarify and mediate, only seemed to intensify her anger. "They could have used theirs or yours," she said sharply, her voice echoing with indignation. She felt disrespected, overlooked, and, above all, treated as if her routines were secondary to everyone else's convenience. I tried to intervene, urging calm and perspective, but the emotional momentum had already built to a point where reason alone could not diffuse it. She labeled my son an asshole and retreated into her room, the sound of the door closing marking the temporary conclusion of a confrontation that was far from over. The air in the house was thick with unspoken judgments, simmering resentment, and the echo of unmet expectations. From that moment, the house became a landscape of careful steps and measured words. I encouraged my son and his girlfriend to apologize. I reminded them that acknowledgement of mistakes was the simplest way to maintain family harmony. My son, after cooling down, complied, offering a somewhat reluctant apology that balanced contrition with lingering justification. His girlfriend, however, dug in her heels. She refused to apologize, unwilling to admit fault or express empathy for the disruption her actions had caused. The refusal stung in a way that highlighted the complexities of interpersonal dynamics within a shared space. My daughter, meanwhile, responded not with confrontation, but with action. She reached out to her psychiatrist, replaced her medication, and reinforced the routines that were essential to her mental health. Her response was practical, precise, and self-protective, an assertion that her well-being could not be compromised by the mistakes or attitudes of others the days following. The incident were charged with a subtle tension that permeated every interaction. Meals were quieter than usual. Casual conversations carried an undercurrent of caution, and gestures were measured, almost tentative. The house was not silent, but it spoke a language of restraint, of unspoken acknowledgement that a boundary had been crossed. Every small movement, every glance, carried with it the weight of the earlier confrontation, reminding us all of the fragility of shared spaces and the importance of communication. My son's insistence that my daughter apologize became a recurring point of friction. He framed the situation through a lens of fairness, arguing that she had overreacted and that reconciliation required acknowledgement of that reaction. My daughter, steadfast and principled, refused. She argued that she had no reason to apologize for the consequences of someone else's negligence or for asserting her boundaries. She pointed out that they should have asked her to move the pills or, at minimum, approached her calmly rather than assuming she would go. Crazy, the argument revealed more than just a disagreement about spilled pills. It exposed the underlying differences in how each of them perceived respect, responsibility, and the nature of apology. My son saw apologies as a form of accountability, a necessary step to mend disrupted relationships. My daughter viewed apologies as meaningful only when they reflected genuine responsibility and acknowledgement of harm done. Her refusal was not obstinate. It was a principled stance that her rights and routines should not be dismissed for the sake of superficial reconciliation. Meanwhile, the girlfriend's decision to stay elsewhere until their condo was ready underscored the consequences of unwillingness to acknowledge mistakes. Her absence was a quiet acknowledgement that harmony required more than convenience. It required accountability. The temporary separation offered space for reflection, for the simmering tensions to cool, and for the recognition that shared living arrangements were not just about proximity, but about mutual respect and consideration. Throughout this period, I navigated the delicate balance of mediation, parental responsibility, and respect for adult autonomy. I recognized that my daughter's anger, while intense, was justified in the context of her needs and boundaries. I also recognized that my son's frustration, though often poorly expressed, stemmed from a desire to maintain order and assert responsibility. My role was not to dictate who was right or wrong in absolute terms, but to guide the family through a process of understanding, reflection, and eventual acknowledgement of each other's perspectives. Conversations were deliberate and cautious. I reminded my children that communication was key, that assumptions and abrupt confrontations could escalate minor incidents into significant conflicts. We discussed the importance of consent and asking permission, particularly when personal space and routines were involved. I encouraged them to reflect on how small actions, like moving a bottle of pills or entering a bathroom, could carry unexpected emotional weight. The incident became a case study in empathy, patience, and the subtle complexities of family life. By the end of the week, a fragile equilibrium had been restored. Apologies had been offered selectively, boundaries reinforced, and routines reinstated. My daughter, having replaced her medication and spoken to her psychiatrist, felt secure again in her control over her personal space. My son had learned, at least partially, that his approach to conflict needed tempering with empathy and foresight, and the girlfriend's temporary absence served as a reminder that accountability and respect were non-negotiable in maintaining household harmony. The incident had been dramatic, not in a sensational sense, but in its emotional impact. It revealed the importance of listening, the necessity of considering others' perspectives, and the consequences of assumptions and miscommunication. Even small actions, like suggesting someone use a bathroom, could have rippling effects when they intersected with deeply held routines and personal vulnerabilities. In the weeks following, the house felt different, quieter, yes, but also more aware. Conversations were more deliberate, and interactions carried a subtle mindfulness that had been absent before. Each member of the family had been forced to confront aspects of their behavior, expectations, and assumptions. The spilled pills incident had become more than just a moment of chaos. It had become a lesson in empathy, communication, and the maintenance of personal boundaries within a shared home. The tension that had initially seemed disruptive eventually revealed itself as an opportunity for growth. It showed the importance of respecting others' routines, the power of carefully chosen words, and the necessity of acknowledging mistakes when they occur. My daughter's steadfastness, my son's gradual understanding, and my role as mediator all contributed to a slow recalibration of household dynamics. It was a reminder that family life, even in its quietest moments, is a complex dance of respect, patience, and recognition of each person's autonomy. The aftermath of the incident became a crucible for understanding boundaries, responsibility, and respect. After the initial storm had passed, the house carried a quiet weight, the kind that comes from unresolved tension paired with slow, deliberate reflection. I watched my daughter move through her routines with renewed attention, reclaiming control over the space that had been temporarily violated. Each pill carefully replaced, each counter wiped clean, each step measured to restore her environment to the way she needed it to be. It was as if, by reasserting order in her bathroom, she was reclaiming a part of herself disrupted by the intrusion. Meanwhile, my son wrestled with lingering feelings of justification and frustration. His insistence that my daughter apologize hadn't waned, even as he recognized that the confrontation had escalated beyond what any of us had anticipated. From his perspective, she had reacted sharply, and in his mind, harmony required acknowledgement of that response. Yet the more he pushed, the more firmly she resisted. She maintained that she had no reason to apologize, not for asserting her boundaries, not for protecting her routines, and not for reacting to someone else's mistake. The girlfriend's absence added another layer to the dynamic. By choosing to stay elsewhere until their condo was ready, she inadvertently underscored the validity of my daughter's concerns. Her refusal to apologize or even acknowledge the disruption had created a vacuum where respect and accountability were absent. It became a silent lesson for all of us. Shared spaces, even temporarily, demand careful consideration, empathy, and communication. I found myself navigating between these conflicting perspectives, balancing empathy with practicality. I had to acknowledge my daughter's right to her space and routines, while also encouraging my son to understand that his approach to conflict needed nuance. The truth was simple. No one was entirely at fault, and yet each action carried consequences that rippled through the household. Missteps, assumptions, and lack of communication had collided in a way that exposed vulnerabilities in our family dynamic. But they also offered an opportunity for growth and reflection. In the days that followed, small acts of reconciliation and understanding began to emerge. My son, having cooled down further, made more deliberate efforts to respect my daughter's space and to communicate more thoughtfully. The girlfriend, while absent from the house, eventually engaged in conversations with my son that emphasized awareness of boundaries and the importance of checking before acting. My daughter, through her calm actions and measured responses, reinforced her right to control her environment and emphasize that respect was earned through acknowledgement, not assumed through proximity. I also reflected on my own role in the incident. Permitting the use of my daughter's bathroom without her consent had been a lapse in judgment, a failure to anticipate the emotional and practical consequences of that decision. It became clear that mediation wasn't just about resolving conflict. After it occurred also required foresight, respect for individual boundaries, and careful communication before any action that could affect someone else. I realized that even well-intentioned decisions can have unforeseen impacts when they intersect with personal routines and vulnerabilities. This realization prompted a broader conversation with my children about shared spaces and expectations. We discussed the importance of asking for permission, considering the emotional and practical stakes, and approaching each other with empathy rather than assumption. These discussions were not always comfortable. They required honesty, patience, and, at times, humility. But over time, they created a framework for understanding that reduced the likelihood of future conflicts and strengthened the underlying trust between us. My daughter's approach to the aftermath was instructive. She did not dwell on anger for its own sake. She took practical steps to restore her routines and maintain her mental health. She replaced her medication, consulted her psychiatrist, and ensured that her daily life was minimally disrupted. Her insistence on her boundaries, coupled with her deliberate actions, sent a clear message: respect is not negotiable, and personal space is not optional. My son, for his part, learned a nuanced lesson about accountability. He recognized that his approach escalating the confrontation, assuming control over communication, and insisting on apologies had exacerbated the conflict. Gradually, he began to appreciate the importance of empathy, perspective, and measured responses. He saw that reconciliation required more than words. It required acknowledgement of mistakes, consideration of others' feelings, and a willingness to adjust behavior. The girlfriend's eventual reintegration into our household, once their condo was ready, was handled with a cautious but deliberate effort to maintain harmony. Discussions about boundaries, permissions, and mutual respect were explicit, leaving little room for the misunderstandings that had sparked the initial conflict. It was a reminder that shared spaces are not inherently harmonious. They require constant attention, negotiation, and conscious effort. Through this experience, I came to understand that family life, especially when multiple adults are involved, is a continuous negotiation of needs, boundaries, and respect. Conflicts are inevitable, but the way they are handled defines the strength of relationships. My daughter's insistence on asserting her boundaries, my son's learning curve in managing conflict, and my role as mediator all contributed to a recalibration of our household dynamics. Each of us emerged with a clearer understanding of expectations, limits, and the importance of empathy in everyday interactions. The incident also highlighted the significance of personal responsibility. My daughter had not only maintained her routines, but had also addressed the practical consequences of the mishap, replacing her medication and consulting her healthcare provider. Her actions emphasized that personal accountability is not only about responding to mistakes, but also about proactively ensuring well-being and stability. In reflecting on the broader implications, it became evident that respect for boundaries is foundational in any relationship, especially within a family. Even small lapses, like suggesting someone use a bathroom, can carry emotional weight and practical consequences if not approached thoughtfully. The key takeaway was that communication, foresight, and empathy must intersect with actions, creating a network of understanding that sustains relationships even in moments of conflict. By the time the household settled back into a more familiar rhythm, the lessons of the incident were embedded in our interactions. My daughter's insistence on control over her space became a standard we all respected. My son's growing awareness of the impact of his words and actions fostered more deliberate communication. And I, as the parent and mediator, learned that foresight, consideration, and acknowledgement of individual needs are as critical as any intervention after conflict arises. Ultimately, the episode became less about spilled pills and more about the architecture of respect, responsibility, and communication within a family. It underscored the idea that even minor disruptions can illuminate deeper truths about trust, boundaries, and the interplay of independence and interdependence. The aftermath was not just about reconciliation. It was about growth, understanding, and the ongoing negotiation that defines life together under one roof. Through reflection, dialogue, and intentional adjustments, we rebuilt a sense of harmony. Apologies, where they were meaningful, were given and received. Boundaries were clarified and respected, and the house, once quietly tense, returned to a rhythm that honored both individual autonomy and shared responsibility. The lessons learned would carry forward, subtle but powerful reminders that even in the smallest moments, empathy, communication, and respect shaped the health and longevity of family bonds. The spilled pills incident, in retrospect, was a catalyst for insight. It revealed vulnerabilities, prompted necessary conversations, and reinforced the importance of asserting boundaries without fear. It reminded us all that living together, even as adults, requires careful consideration, mutual respect, and a willingness to learn from mistakes. In the end, our family emerged more conscious, more empathetic, and more attuned to the delicate balances that sustain life under one roof.